Morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's podcast. I'm Chloe Tetro, the health coach here in Ready Care. And for today, we're going to have a look at something that a lot of you would have familiarity with, be it firsthand or just from a topic's point of view. It's the topic of stress and cortisol. So, for a lot of us, unfortunately, living in the 21st century, stress is a massive part of our life, be it from a work perspective, a home perspective, or just the expectations that tend to be put on people. From an evolutionary perspective, however, stress in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It's more the physiological and psychological emotional impacts that can happen from a chronic period of stress. So today we'll be looking at cortisol in a little bit more of a focus and really explaining the mechanisms of what's happening from a brain perspective when chronic stress and chronic cortisol levels tend to come in. We usually have some idea as a concept that stress long term is something that's not particularly good for us. But I'd really like to kind of expand a bit on cortisol, what it is and what it does, some of the damaging impacts that it can have as a prolonged chronic exposure, and really have a look at, are there any particular avenues that we can look at in combating stress and making sure that we mitigate some of those negative effects. So to begin with, cortisol, what is it and what does it do? So when we're looking at the mechanisms of stress, there is cortisol will play a huge part in it. So to begin with, in our body, we have something called the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. And there is an interaction with the endocrine glands of the brain and the kidneys in this HPA, which controls our stress responses and activates the release of a hormone called cortisol. So cortisol in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. We have it as the body's natural alarm system, for want of a better word. So you might be familiar with the fight or flight or freeze response. And cortisol would play a huge part in that. So we can come across situations, whether it be fado as cavemen, or whether it be in, our present day, that might require a focused, narrow attention, more energy. So what cortisol does, it can increase the sugar in the bloodstream, which will give us that very, very quick glucose release and energy release. It can keep inflammation down temporarily. It regulates the blood pressure and controls the sleep and wake cycle. So it's giving you that kind of boost of energy that you can handle the external stress, whether it be a physical stress, psychological, emotional stress, and usually it tends to go down afterwards. So you have your high spike, and you might notice it, like I'm thinking even college days, where something might have been left a little bit too late, or you could see it in work assignments or anything like that, where basically you need that really, really narrowed focus. You're going to be working a little bit with your cortisol there, or whether you have an altercation, physical, or anything that requires you to be really, really narrowly focused. So in and of itself, cortisol isn't necessarily a bad thing. Where the troubles can emerge is when that cortisol level, that blood sugar being up high, that narrow field of focus is kept at a continuous high state. Chronic cortisol then would be that inability to drop back down, that inability to regulate back to a normal level and really consistently getting that hormone through the body. So from a purely physiological point of view, elevated levels of cortisol can lead to weight gain, especially around the midsection, because if you're thinking about it, there's quite an amount of glucose going into the body. It can cause diabetes as a knock-on effect. It can cause muscle weakness, and then things like heart conditions, heart disease. We've all heard, horror stories, unfortunately, of people that had chronic unchecked stress levels that may have led to cardiovascular problems. It can cause trouble sleeping, which again will have quite a big knock-on effect as a long-term difficulty in the day-to-day life. Problems with digestion, there's connections with IBS, and mostly the cause of that will be that if you think of a high stress, the body will start to shut down anything it doesn't deem as pertinent in the moment. So it'll say, okay, digestion's a great thing to do when we have time, but right now we need to be in survival mode. So it'll start to shut down things that it deems kind of secondary to your survival. Again, the body's usually trying to help us out. It doesn't do anything just to mess with us. Um, but a big thing that can happen, and what I'll be focusing on, and we can see this in terms of the more psychological effects of chronic cortisol, will be the difficulties it can bring with the likes of memory, concentration, and mood. So it's very common to have a degree of restlessness, to have a degree of your cognitive function starting to decline a little bit. And there's a twofold process that I'll explain there shortly. But symptoms of overwhelm would be a huge thing with chronic stress, and moodiness will come in. Now, there is the knock-on effect there because the sleep cycle has been dysregulated. I was trying to think of the word. That there is a knock-on effect just from a purely physiological point of view, but to have a look really at what the impacts to the cognitive functioning, reasoning, and ability for adaptability and change, we need to look at a part of the brain called the hippocampus. So the hippocampus would be involved in things like learning, memory, adaptability, and change, and elevated levels of cortisol. Like we mentioned a while ago, your brain starts to shut down things it doesn't really think is hugely necessary at that time. It'll start to cut down the electrical signals to the hippocampus, and those over time will start to deteriorate. So there's a two factor impact. Your ability for learning and memory starts to go down, but also, which is nature's kind of cruel thing here, the hippocampus helps in the management and control of stress. So you can see there's a bit of a catch-22 happening. More elevated stress results deteriorates the electrical signals to the hippocampus, which bring down the learning and effectively make the control of stress more difficult. Cortisol levels that are quite high for a large amount of time can also start to deteriorate synaptic neurons. So you're going to effectively see a shrinking of the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is massive for, it's often called the executive of the brain because it really looks at large decision making, things that are just that are removed from just purely survival mechanisms. So things like long-term planning, making decisions that have a long-term effect and how those affect where you want to be in your life versus what is happening right now. So instead of just being purely a response to stimulus that's happening on the outside and very quick automatic, it pauses and goes, what's better for me here long term? It's often the mechanism involved in really kind of grafting out better trajectories for yourself, aligning yourself more with where you want to be long term, the larger plans, hence the CEO name. So the prefrontal cortex is associated with concentration, which is exceedingly, important when you're making those types of decisions. Judgment, social interactions. So adaptability and change, which is in the hippocampus, goes down, and the prefrontal cortex receptivity, there we go, said it, tends to go down quite a bit. So the impact of that is if you are in that high stress environment, you're more so operating from a very responsive state. We've all been in situations where an example I give is the email you shouldn't have sent. when your when your stress levels go up and up and up and up, your ability to go, "Oof, was that the right thing to do here?" goes down and down and down. And you'll often see that there's a little bit of a domino effect can happen with that, where one thing goes a little bit askew, brings up the stress levels, creates another reaction that can skew it and skew it and skew it. So, oftentimes, giving ourselves a little bit of acknowledgement that your ability to respond with the better outcome from the prefrontal cortex is diminished when the cortisol levels are up. Um, the prefrontal cortex would usually need to be firing on all cylinders, so to speak, because what it's doing is it's utilizing quite a bit of energy in your brain and your body to look in your decision making at things like probability of reward, which is oftentimes what we gravitate towards. We have our reward center, so we tend to make decisions based from when we are firing on all cylinders. What is the probability of a reward? What is the payoff, the effort, and the timing? Those are all factors that tend to come in when we are making a rational, relaxed decision, let's say. However, when your brain is firing with, or misfiring, I should say, with too much cortisol, what it tends to do is actually make your amygdala, which is the part of your brain that's involved in the stress response, danger response, and fear response. That tends to go up quite a bit, and it starts to really feed that part of the brain, so that you're making an awful lot of your decisions based out of fear, based out of previously assimilated associations with your threat response. So you can see that there's a little bit of a cascade happens there, with cortisol levels being high. Not only do you have the physiological aspects starting to kind of misfire, but also from a psychological perspective, your ability to respond to things starts to go down quite considerably. There is a little test, um, how would you put it? A little experiment that was done with regards looking at how we make decisions when we are coming from that space. Just trying to see your man's name there, because I had it here. It's a neuroscience researcher, and I'll get the name by the end of it. So basically, it's looking at from the how your brain operates when it is under cortisol. So the basis of the experiment is that you give either a coworker or the person involved in it a very short time to answer this question. And I'll pose it to you now, so you can test your own stress response. So it's called the BAT test experiment. So you give somebody a short amount of time, let's say 30 seconds. And in that 30 seconds, you pose them this very simple maths test question, where you say there's a bat and a ball. Their combined cost is €1.10. Now, the bat is €1 more expensive than the ball. How expensive is the ball? Cool. So most people will fire off an answer very, very quickly. And I have to say, I fell into this category as well. So my first thing was, oh, it's obviously €1. But no, or sorry, the ball is obviously 10 cents, sorry. But actually, if you step back a little bit and go, it's €1 more expensive, the correct answer is 5 cents. So it's 5 cents and €1.05 equaling to €1.10. So it's showing how our brain doesn't necessarily take a step back and look at the information and process it from a point that we would usually have when we have a little bit of distance and more of a relaxed environment to get that little bit of a look on questions. So you can see in that very, very simple test how that can have a knock-on effect, particularly like this is an area studied particularly in HR, for how people tend to respond in high stress environments. So that's the horror picture done and dusted with. What can we do to combat stress? So there are a number of things that can be done. So the thing that I actually usually start off with, I go backwards, let's say, is oftentimes when people look at ways to combat stress, they tend to give you the firefighting, which I will also give you because it's handy to have. But what I mean by firefighting is oftentimes stress doesn't happen in a vacuum, especially chronic stress doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's something that incrementally becomes more and more pervasive in your life. It's something that takes a while to accumulate. So, what I would tend to say to people is if you have um, pinpointed, that kind of awareness that there is chronic stress happening, instead of just firefighting the symptoms, really take a look at the environment that you're finding yourself in consistently, because firefighting and having tools and tips and tricks to combat the acute stress are really, really necessary. They have absolutely have their value, but really, if you don't have a look at the environment that you're constantly in, you are I want to talk. That the myth of Sisyphus, where he puts the boulder up every day, gets to the top, and the new day starts, and he's back at the bottom, and he's pushing the boulder up again. You're going to find yourself in an environment that really is programmed and blueprinted to put yourself back in that stressful situation. Now, I know that with the way life happens, sometimes there is no way to remove yourself from that initial stressor, but especially with things like work, and maybe specific dynamics that might be happening in your life, the first tip I would always say, start from the bottom up. Is there a way to look at that initial cause? Is there a way to change that initial cause? That could be things like seeking counseling help if it's something that you've seen built up over years and maybe decades. Is there a way to maybe shift that fundamental ground that you're beginning with? Um, does it mean having a conversation at work about the day in, day out of what you're experiencing? And really give yourself the best fighting chance to start from the bottom up, from a grounding that is supporting your combating of that chronic stress. That aside, um, the other thing would be to lean on your resources. So, especially with work environments, most places now, especially since the pandemic, have a really good support system when it comes to wellness, and leaning on supports like that where they are available. Social interaction is a huge one, and it sometimes can be as simple as looking at discussing something, so that you're getting an amount of clarity on it, but you're also getting that social bolster from it, where there is a degree of oxytocin, endorphins in sharing that with somebody, which kind of brings me more to the physiological and hormonal aspects. So the two biggest exercises and practices that you can bring into your life to mitigate, from a purely physiological point of view, the cortisol being elevated, is exercise and meditation. So both of those have a proven, studied and proven reduction levels of the body's stress hormones with cortisol and adrenaline. So cortisol and adrenaline will both be in the chronic kind of fight or flight responses. Both of those practices will also stimulate the release of endorphins. So endorphins are mood elevators, and they are the body's natural painkillers. So they can tend to really bring you out of that high intensity cortisol. And if you remember back to the hippocampus, the decrease in the cortisol levels with the release of endorphins actually increases the size of the hippocampus. So your brain is quite elastic, even though I painted quite a horror picture with the damages that can happen. A lot of the brain's activities are quite fluid and quite plastic, insofar as repeating an action over and over can tend to push the brain out of a particular way of being back into another one. So, where that can be detrimental with things like repeated stress and being in that state, repeating practices that create that sense of endorphins will tend to reverse some of the, if not most, to be honest with you, of the damages that have been produced. So, looking at your sleep cycle, because your sleep will have such a knock on effect on your day and your ability from an energy perspective and a mitochondrial perspective to be able to take on specific tasks and fuel your brain for specific tasks and actions like the prefrontal cortex needs. It needs to have that degree of nutrition. It needs to have that degree of sleep as your kind of first steps towards it. Introducing things like exercise, and it's 120 minutes is what the American Cardiovascular Association tends to recommend for its minimum recommended for overall health is 120 minutes of exercise per week. And that can be broken down in any way that you see fit. It can be 2 1-hour sessions of walking. It can be 4 30-minute ones of walking. Or bringing more into your week will be great for that. As the endorphins go up and the cortisol levels go down, your overall ability to cope with stress tends to go up. And meditation, and as I said in a previous talk, meditation looks very different for lots of different folk. For some people, it is it's the headspace apps type of things. It's the waking up apps. It's having that guided meditation where they close their eyes or they focus on a single point and they make that part of their everyday practice, where there is a degree of awareness and detachment from the emotions that come up. And being able to make that a kind of scheduled aspect. For some people, however, that doesn't particularly sit with their nature, their personality. It may not be something that suits them or that they're particularly comfortable with. And for those type of people, I would say anything that you bring mindful activity to, which would be awareness and a sense of detachment with. So an example of that could be mindful walking. So mindful walking is really soaking in as much of the experience that you're able to do. So use your 5 senses. What can you hear? What can you smell? What can you see? Taste, touch, etc. And what that does is it slows down your brain's processes to really be in a receptive state of awareness. And that brings up your endorphins. So endorphins would be they're the feel-good ones, but dissimilarly to dopamine, which is all forward projection, endorphins are very much to do with your present state and being pleased and happy in your present state, which brings down the cortisol levels. Some people use drawing as a practice, journaling as a practice. Anything that brings you back into the present moment is, from a psychological point of view, is going to kind of bring that kind of relaxation state and out of that kind of anxiety mode of future projection. But really, we're looking at this from a purely physiological point of view, coming back to that present state, be it through exercise or meditation, will bring down your cortisol levels and bring up your endorphins. So that's the kind of overall picture. So stress is unfortunately for a lot of us a natural part of, or not a natural part, but an expected ordinary that we are facing most days, where we would have been able to fight off the adversary in the past. I like to think that, but really, I don't know how well I would have done faced with a jaguar. But where there was an end point, let's say back in prehistoric time, caveman time, our hardware has not quite caught up to our way of life. So our hardware still very much operates on there should be an endpoint to the stress. Our environmental factors don't really allow for that at the moment. So a lot of people can find themselves in quite an elevated stress period where cortisol may have been beneficial for that narrow focus. I'm thinking back to my college days of staying up till 1 a.m, hyper focused on the task that I was doing. But unfortunately, as that can progress into your day in, day out, it can have quite a negative knock-on effect physiologically and psychologically. So to mitigate some of that, bringing yourself back into presence, bring yourself back into awareness, making sure that your sleep cycle is well regulated, that you're fueling your body with foods that can help the prefrontal cortex come online, and that there is a degree of addressing if there are any underlying issues or challenges that you're coming up over and over, that maybe having a look at that in its fundamental factor of environment might be a good start point. Other than that, good food, good sleep, exercise, and meditation when you can. And that can be mindful exercise, it can be reading, drawing, going for walks. Bringing those in over a period of time will physiologically increase your endorphins and reduce your cortisol levels. Thanks a million, guys. If there are any quick questions, please pop them into the comment section and I'll do my best to answer them. I'll give a few seconds for that if there are any. Otherwise, Andrew will be back with you next week. And thanks a million for watching. And for those of you listening back, thanks for listening. And we will chat to you next time. Thanks a million.